Okay, I shall start. Building a phenomenological ontology of the body, a body which is an I. The English translation of Michel Henry's Philosophie et Phénoménologie du Corps appeared in 1975 as Philosophy and Phenomenology of the Body. In this book, Henry frequently uses Biron's arguments to promote his own philosophy, intending to deploy his first serious approach to a phenomenological ontology of the body, under the strong influence of Maine de Biron and his analysis towards movement. I shall, unfortunately, be compelled to treat this subject far too briefly, as it can be treated properly only by giving long catalogues of facts. Biron was an opponent of the 18th century philosophy advanced by the English empiricists Locke and Hume. Henry describes the kind of body outlined by Biron as an incarnated body. It is the original fact with which his phenomenology begins, because the body, in its original nature, belongs to the sphere of existence, which is the sphere of subjectivity itself. Since Henry's work consistently seeks to locate his phenomenology of the body in the joy and pain of ordinary reality, specifically located in praxis and real life, I thought that his contributions would be interesting to many different types of approach within the mental health towards the body. According to Henry, the body must become the theme of an investigation which takes the real man as its object, not the abstract man of idealism, but this being of flesh and blood which we all are. This is his project of a first philosophy. For Henry, who follows Biron, the body is subjective and is the ego itself, a body which is an I. Biron seeks to substitute a transcendental phenomenology for a classical and empirical psychology, gesture followed by Henry with his material phenomenology. Byronism is essentially a philosophy of motor effort that wishes to move the understanding of the body away from rationalists' approach that regard movement as an unconscious or physiological process. Henry supports Biron's argument against the dominant philosophies of the 19th century by writing that contrary to rationalism, it is necessary to say that all knowledge derives from experience, because the condition of possibility of experience is itself an experience. Henry's later works, such as La Barbarie and Incarnation, are also strongly influenced by Biron's rejection of empiricism and rationalism, which deal with the abstract man reduced to the condition of a pure subjectivity. In fact, the rephrasing of being in terms of effort and resistance brings Biron closer to Spinoza than Descartes, and Henry's affinities with Spinoza are well known by his master's degree thesis. The epistemological background, the rejection of Hume's empiricism and the ontological lack in Kantian presuppositions. For Biron, empiricism only knows a region of ontology that describes being as transcendent and sensible in terms of facts regarded as natural phenomena. It conceives of the elements of life as purely artificial ideas of class or gender, as collections of abstract modes of sensation. Hume understands the body as an ensemble of transcendent masses, or as he writes himself, as the interior play of nerves and muscles that the will is supposed to put in action in the movements of our limbs. In comparing Hume's understanding of the body to that of an anatomist or a physiologist, Biron asks what species of analogy is there between the representative knowledge of the play and functions of our organs that an anatomist or physiologist is capable of knowing, and the intimate sentiment of existence which corresponds to these functions. Henry points out that Hume does not have any ontology of subjectivity, that it does not accept Biron's claim that we are able to have a sentiment without knowing in any way its means, and that it has no need to speak of our desire, our wish to accomplish movement, since it is not disposed to any theory likely to take account of the belonging of these psychic states to the self. We would have to be in possession of an ontology of subjectivity and not an empirical conception of interior life. From the perspective of a phenomenological ontology, this causality, before being an idea, is a power, and this power is revealed to us in the same way as the being of the ego which it is fused. In Henry's works, the first condition which a theory of the movement of one's own body must satisfy is to be in a position to account for a feeling of this movement which I accomplish myself, of a power in the course of its exercise, a power which is mine. This also shows the complete failure of empirical psychology, because the type of movement which intellectualism attempts to reconstruct is in reality only a representation of movement, whereas the being of movement and the problem of its original knowledge completely escapes it. Similar objections arise towards Kantian presuppositions. In a Kantian perspective, only two sources of knowledge exist: sensation and judgment. As Henry puts it, the entire philosophy of Maine de Biron consists precisely in the affirmation that the feeling of action does not result from a sensation, that action is known in itself insofar as it pertains to the spheres of subjectivity, insofar as it is a fact of the relationship of immediate knowledge to itself. That's why Henry asks, quote, "Where does the being of the ego find a place in such an ontology? Where is its concrete life, its action, its movement?" In order to be in a position to answer these questions, which are the lot of first philosophy, we must first reject Kantian ontology and be possessed of an ontology which is first of all an ontology of life, an ontology of subjectivity and the ego. Doubtless, I judge that it is I who act. Such a judgment presupposes the intervention within my mind of the idea of causality, but the transcendental deduction of the categories has shown us that the latter do not float in air, nor do they occupy our mind by accident. Rather, they have a foundation which is precisely the concrete life of the ego, its action and its movement. In a word, its body. Not only the idea of necessity presupposes the idea of causality, and that the idea of causality presupposes the idea of action, we must still see that the idea of action presupposes action itself. At this point, Henry shares the same ideas developed by Freud in his project of psychology and the main role of energy and movement in the constitution of subjectivity.
To nejde víc na hlas?
The twofold...
Nejde víc na hlas.
I'm listening another talk. Shall I continue?
Yes, please. If you rejoin, please do remember to turn off your mics. Thanks. Do continue.
Okay, thank you. The twofold usage of signs and the problem of the fundamental ontological ambiguity which leads to the body object. This section discusses the role of language operating in how we end considering our body as an object. Cartesianism, empiricism, and Kantian philosophy, the same as mainstream biomedicine, conceive the body as an object. According to these perspectives, in which this body object belongs to nature, res extensa, Everything takes place as if the body were nothing other than this object which we see, and as if the original being of the body, whose ontological analysis we have given, were nothing but a chimera. There is a sort of absorption of the originally subjective being of the body in this body which manifests itself to us among things. The first becomes interior to the second, and the entire being of our body is reduced to its constituted being. Henry, again following Biron, upholds the idea that if the element immanent to my body is considered as the nucleus of the body object which I can see or touch, that which we call immanence has thus become the very essence of the transcendent. But before clarifying the fundamental ontological ambiguity which presides over the occurrence of such a transformation, we first must show how this transformation is at the origin of the perception or the knowledge which we have of our body, of this knowledge as it is expressed by common sense in everyday language. This common sense language says, the eye sees the panorama, the hand moves. Sorry, I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. This common sense language says, the eye sees the panorama, the hand moves towards the table and touches it. Its ear hears the melody. The eye, the hand, the ear are elements of the transcendent body. They manifest themselves to consciousness in the truth of being. There they have a place, as spatial configuration and perceived or scientifically determined relationships with all the objects of nature. It is precisely such transcendent elements which bear within themselves the nucleus of the body. Id est, this ensemble of powers whereby the body sees, moves, touches, and hears. Nevertheless, the latter had been characterized by us as belonging to a sphere of radical immanence, as constituting the being of a subjective body, affirms Henry. The results of the ontological analysis of the original being of our body constitute a part of absolute knowledge upon which phenomenological ontology is built. Here appears the genuine Biranian contribution. Moreover, adds Henry, how could we maintain this absurdity whereby ultimately what we see and touch would also be that which sees and touches? This body which we see and which we call our own presupposes, as Biran has shown us, another body which sees and which touches all things, and among them this body which is seen and touched. It is this other body, which is the original body, whose being has been determined as belonging to the sphere of absolute subjectivity, outside which it was unable to arise without losing everything, which makes it what it is. This original being of our body is an ontological power which cannot be identified or incorporated into an element of nature. This identification is a naive representation and actually an illusion. It is the general theory of this illusion that Maine de Biron proposes to us in the analysis of what he calls the twofold usage of signs. Let us consider the experience of seeing. It is an internal, transcendental experience. The experience transcends itself towards a world, but it takes place entirely within a sphere of radical immanence. If we now express in language this experience of vision, we use the word to see, which is, to speak as Maine de Biron, the sign of seeing. How this sign is related to the internal experience of seeing, how, in a general way, language is based on the life of absolute subjectivity which it expresses, this is what cannot be clarified here, states Henry. The process of foundation of reflective language is ultimately reduced to that of natural language. Now, Henry lays weight on the fact that the process of foundation of reflective language is ultimately reduced to that of natural language. Even if we assume that the words I see designate the representation of my seeing and not my seeing itself, nevertheless, it is upon the latter, upon its radically immanent experience and upon it alone, that their meaning ultimately rests. The entire ontological ambiguity in the phenomenon described by Maine de Biran under the name of the twofold usage of signs resides in the fact that a relationship is established between the words I see and a physiological organ, such that the sign to see has a twofold usage and designates both the eye, or at least a property thereof, as well as the internal transcendental experience of seeing. From this stems a frequently illusory similarity between the physiologist and the metaphysician, who, while using the same terms, believe they are dealing with the same things or subscribing to the same system of ideas. The relationship of the original being of the body to the system of organs which physiology studies can only be, according to Biran, a symbolic relationship at the end of which the physiological division appears as a symbol or a sign of the transcendental division. For example, if we consider movement, physiology will think that it can account for it by imagining a center of action in the brain, which will serve as the origin from which this movement begins. But is this anything other than a symbol? Can the individual ego be identified with any organic center? Is the action which we relate objectively to such a center the same as that which we attribute to ourselves in the intimate consciousness of effort? Are these not two ideas, two facts of a totally different order? How can the mind pass from one to the other? Conclusions: the ontological difference, the relationship between these two facts, the physiological body and the original being of our body. Henry concludes that since the relationship between these two facts, i.e., between the physiological body and the original being of our body, is analogous to the relationship between the sign and the thing signified, the philosophical meaning of this relationship is twofold. On the one hand, the sign aids us in our comprehension of the thing signified. Every metaphysical analysis, confidently basing itself upon a physiological division between the organs, their functions and interplay, receives therefrom this clarity, this apparent facility which images communicate to reflective notions, by uniting themselves with them as symbols destined to explain what is in itself obscure. On the other hand, this aid is illusory. It makes us believe that by combining certain organic movements, we can deduce psychological facts which can only be verified by the intimate sense, such that the so-called explanations teach us nothing about the subject in question and only serve to obscure it by substituting confused images for simple and perfectly clear ideas of reflection. This latter text, which again asserts the absolute character of the evidence inherent in the sphere of transcendental immanence, suggests that we re-question many analyses of Biran in which physiological investigations appear as a necessary and useful complement to peculiarly psychological investigations. Towards the question of the two bodies, the subjective body and the body object, it becomes immediately apparent that the duality which splits in an incomprehensible manner the unity of the being of my body, and which causes this being to be given to me twice, so to speak, finds its foundation in the ontological structure of truth, a structure in virtue of which something manifests itself to us in the truth of transcendent being only on condition of a more original revelation in a milieu of absolute immanence. At last, Henry states that ontological dualism is the foundation for the twofold usage of science, because there exist, as Main Deviran says, two sources of evidence. Our body is given us in a way such that each of its original powers, concerning which we have an immediate knowledge in the subjective experience of movement, which constitutes its essence, also manifests itself to us in the form of an organ or some physiological or spatial determination. The difference between the original being of this power and the organ which seems to be its instrument is in no way situated on an ontic level. It is not a difference between something and something else. It is an ontological difference, not a difference in individuality, but in the manner of being, that is relative to the region at the heart of which being manifests itself and exists. Thank you very much. That's it.
Thank you very much. That's a very rich and a dense talk, one in an idiom that's not quite my own. So no one's yet come up with a question, but please do now type in some questions for Ignacio. And I mean, perhaps I could just ask one thing. We can bring the body under different descriptions. So the body, bring it under a physiological description, or bring it under a description of, in terms of a moment of agency or subjectivity. But why talk about there being two bodies? I mean, that just sounds like a confusing idiom. I mean, or maybe it's just a fanciful kind of way of putting something. But why not just talk about one body? Because after all, the body which we see and touch is the body which sees and touches. It doesn't seem to presuppose another body. That seems like a perverse kind of idiom to me, at least. Am I just reacting in too British a way to this, or is there something in this, as it were?
Well, it may be a first reaction, because at least this paper tries to pose what Henry, following Main Deviran, tries to build as a phenomenological ontology of the body. So that's why, though I am a clinical psychologist, I wanted to share this work, which is maybe strictly philosophical, but I think that it would be very important to maintain this duality between these two types of ways of conceiving the body. Because in fact, we can also find many other, I think, developments toward this point. It is not the same, for example, the lived experience of our body than the pain you may have in our body object as its materiality, I mean. So I think there are many orientations that try to maintain at least this distinction, because it is in fact a different way to understand our corporality. There are many authors. Yeah.
Sure. So I guess that, you mean, in a way, we made the same point there, because if you're thinking there's two different ways to conceptualize the body, or two different ways of thinking about it, then when we got an it, a singular thing, but having, like I said, bring it under different descriptions rather than say there are two bodies and so on. But in this, we've got some questions coming up on the side here. One from Ian and one from I presume it's Chris Mawson. I'll let you ask them to yourself, to answer them.
Which one's the first? Ian, I am being asked, that's?
Yes, yeah. Ian.
I am being asked to start new assessments and therapies by management, but I have doubts about it.
No. Scroll right down to the bottom of the chat.
What do you think?
First of all,
okay.
And then what do you think to sex and gender? Yeah.
What do you think to sex and gender? Bodies are mosaics, gestalts of the overall sense of being male, female, or intersegment, clothed or naked. The encounter between persons is mitteilbliche, consensual felt encounter. I don't know what's the question there, Ian, sorry. If you can clarify, Ian, your question, please. When Freud writes of the ego as the body ego, psychological body ego, this implies two versions of body. Yes, of course. Well, in fact, I don't know the name, Mawson, yeah, Mawson. As Mawson is saying, yes, of course, Freud himself has, I think, this distinction between the Körper and the Leib. Yes, and Heidegger too. I think there are, in German authors, this is something very, very frequent, I think. And I think it is a very important distinction, especially in mental health. I think the main example of this would be the experience that many psychotics have of their own body. We could not understand those experiences of the body if we don't maintain this distinction between two types of perception of the body, and in fact of the idea of the two bodies, the body object and the lived body, the experienced body, or even the fantasies. I mean, I am thinking now, for example, in anorexia. When you have an anoretic person, he may see in the mirror as fat when his body object is still thin, but the perception of her or his body may be completely other. So I think that this is a very important distinction, that it needs, in fact, a philosophical foundation. And I think that Michel Henry, it's a very interesting author to think the philosophical foundations, the phenomenological philosophical foundations of this type of approach. Phantom limb pain and sensation, yes, of course, the phantom limb pain and sensation is interesting in this regard. Yes, sure. It's about, Ian, it's about sex bodies and how people get understood as socially meaningful as a gender type of person. No one talks about this, but it is a central part of being a person. Yes, of course. The problem, I think, I won't dare to even speak of the problem of gender, because that would need a much developed work. This is just a philosophical basis. It's not even a psychopathological work. But yes, I think that there are many developments that we can think from this departing point. Any other question?
Looks like Ian's typing something more. I don't have any more at the moment.
Michel Henry's works, I think that they are not very much known yet. And there are lots of very interesting developments that may be very useful to the topics that the subjects we are used to study in this type of approach to mental health. Was judged by Husserl. Ian, it's about sex bodies and how people get used to. What you said about Michel Henry was judged by Husserl, who only mentioned it in passing. Yes, of course, in Husserl you may also find some types of this type of distinctions, but I think that Michel Henry makes the point by studying the philosophy of Main de Biran, because Main de Biran is a contemporary of Descartes and Spinoza, and we don't usually even mention Main de Biran. I didn't know even who he was before reading Michel Henry. And the same as Spinoza for the problem of affections, there are many other philosophers besides Descartes that have made very interesting they have very interesting works to think these points. There is not only Descartes or not even Husserl. I think that the geniality of Henry is to find in Main de Biran a sort of first phenomenologist in the way he thinks corporality not as an object, That's why I thought it was interesting to distinguish his thought of Hume, Locke, Kant, etc. Well, Henry has also many very severe critics to Husserl too. It's a very, very large work, but it's a very, very interesting work. I'm studying the whole works of Henry, and I'm finding very, very interesting subjects.
Would you say that there's something in him which isn't in Merleau-Ponty?
Well, that's another good point. Yes, I think that there are different approaches. I don't know that well Merleau-Ponty so as to make a precise distinction, but it may be, I think, quite near Merleau-Ponty, especially the Merleau-Ponty of phenomenology of perception. Yes.
I'm hoping it's very near, because then I don't have to go and read any.
Yes.
Professor
Zahavis has wrote a very interesting paper toward this point that I suggest to read. Yes, yes.
Any more for anyone else, or we can have a little break before our next talk, which might be a good idea. Things we're all probably quite. You've just given us our 7th talk of the day, and we still have 3 more to do. So we're grateful for our afternoon speakers. I'm going to stop the recording now, and I'm going to say thank you again once very much.
Thank you for the patience.
Thank you.